Welcome to Champions Corner, where we have real talk with real caregivers, giving caregivers a voice and helping them redefine normal on their care journey, featuring the caregiving.com champions. My name is Christina Keys. I'll be one of your hosts today, and today we'll be talking about life after caregiving, the recovery beyond grief as a caregiver. I have taken care of my mother for 10 years. She passed in December. And I also have been taking care of my ex-boyfriend since 2019. Both of them suffered from a stroke. Let's go ahead and find out who our other guests are today. And we'll start with our other co-host, Miss Felicia.
Hello, everyone. My name is Felicia Phillips. I'm a caregiver champion representing the state of Georgia. And for the past 8 years, I had been a caregiver for both my mother and my father. My father had Parkinson's and Parkinson's-related dementia, and he passed away in December of last year. And I still care for my mother, who is 74 with Alzheimer's and vascular dementia and a host of chronic conditions.
Hi, my name is Danielle Mila. I'm a former sandwich generation caregiver, and I'm representing the state of California.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jennifer Fink. I took care of my mom for 3 years after the death of my father, and I represent Greater Northern California.
Fabulous. So let's talk about life after caregiving. Felicia, why don't you get us started?
Absolutely. So, ladies, today we're all ladies. Our first question that we want to talk about is, what was your expectation of life after caregiving, and did reality match your expectation? And I'm going to kick it off and say that, and I think, Jennifer, we may have some similarities. I recently lost my father. And so while I did have some expectations of what life would be like after caregiving, what caught me off guard was the fact that I was caregiving for two. So in losing my father, I still have to care for my mother. And it's been, I think it'll be 2 months tomorrow. And so that has been really a challenge for me and something that I did not expect. I expected to feel a sense of grief and loss. I expected to feel a sense of relief and to struggle with that idea, and even a sense of guilt. My father had Parkinson's, and dealing with him every single day was absolutely difficult on top of caregiving for my mother. So the reality is, for me right now, there's a level of relief. I probably would have said no to even being a part of this podcast if my father were still here. So there are things that I'm now free to do. I can leave the house without worrying about if there's someone that's at home to be with my father. So there's a level of freedom, but there's also a level of without proper, guidance and coaching and having the right people in your village to talk to, there's a level of guilt. I feel guilty that I'm now free to go out. I've been going out every single weekend and it's been a beautiful thing, but it's like, oh my gosh, did my dad have to die for me to feel like I can live? And then also just embracing the idea that you can have relief and grief at the same time. I can miss him, but be relieved at the same time. So those are some of the things that hit me. We're going to talk about the other part of that a little bit later on in the podcast. But I think right now I'm still stuck in the grief and life after caregiving. And it's like, for me, the question is this really life after caregiving? Because now I have a new normal to navigate as a caregiver of one, as opposed to a caregiver of two, in completely different stages with different needs. So that's that's my answer from my perspective right now. And I think that it's something that you never know what you're actually going to feel until it happens. I remember the day my father died, I didn't know what I was actually going to do. And I actually went downstairs and my mother was sitting next to him. And I said, oh, is he still asleep? I'm bouncy happy. I was going to try to give him some soup in a syringe. He was on hospice. And my mother said, he's still sleeping. And I walk over to him and he's not breathing. And I'm like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. So I didn't tell my mother, ran upstairs, told my husband, like, he's dead. He's dead. Oh my God, I can do this. I can do this. I can do this. So you never know until it happens. I bless God that I have strong faith, and God has just allowed me to navigate this, along with the help of organizations and, people like the Caregiver Champions, Christina, and all of you. So that's my take on it. I am going to now check in and see what it's been like for you ladies. Let's start with Danielle. Why don't you tell us what, again, your expectation of life after caregiving was, and if your reality actually matched your expectation?
Yeah. So my grandmother passed away, who I was a primary caregiver for. She passed away in September. So a lot of my memories are quite fresh and quite new. I haven't fully gone through the after caregiving process like many others in this podcast. But I was expecting chaos to happen, and chaos did happen. Chaos meaning family drama, estate issues. But I was just hoping to get those all done very quickly. And as a financial professional, I was just like, I can do this really quickly. I can be the hero that I was when I was a family caregiver. And unfortunately, that didn't go exactly the way I had planned or the way I wanted it to. I just want to be renewed and be refreshed once the estate process was complete. And the state process is still not complete. So it's been a reminder to me that I need to still rebuild and focus on myself, even though I'm dealing with still kind of after the facts of my grandmother passing away.
Right. Yeah. That's another thing. Is the estate planning, the funeral process, just all of those things. Even when you think that you have figured everything out or you've planned everything out, there's always just something that something or some things, right, that don't go as planned. And it's a really difficult time while you're still managing grief. And I think that's one of the hard parts, is that we're trying to get back to a normal, or get to a new normal while still grieving, while still handling estate business. I have thank you cards literally that I was going to send out yesterday, but it was President's Day, so I couldn't. But, I absolutely understand that it is absolutely a challenge. And it sounds like some of our expectations have been met, while at other times there are things that just creep up that we didn't expect. So let's hear from someone else. How about Jennifer?
Okay, so my mom passed away at the very beginning of COVID, so March 31st, 2020. We had downsized to try to re-navigate our lives. And then COVID hits and my mom dies. So unfortunately, post-caregiving has not lived up to what I was expecting. Not sure what I was expecting. I hadn't really thought about it. My mom was just barely 77 when she passed away. And also due to toxic family, we never had, and COVID, we never had any kind of service for my mom. So I have personally done things to memorialize her and tributes to her, but nothing has been done as a family. And apparently that's all on me, because I guess I'm the only one that should be planning that stuff, even though I'm not the one that put the brakes on what I had in mind. So my experiences basically were, we had COVID, we had the shutdowns, my mom passes away, there's nothing we can do. And we just kind of went on with daily lives. The difference between her passing and my dad's passing was tremendous. We had a lot of outpouring of thoughts and love and warm wishes. With my dad, we had a big, really huge funeral. And with my mom, we basically had nothing. I think I got like one condolence card and one family sent a meal, which, I totally understand, but that it did make it even more difficult, because it was literally like the whole world was like a big shrug. Oh, she died. Okay, fine. Moving on now. And so that was my immediate post caregiving experience. Since it's been almost 4 years, and we're going to touch on this later, because I have some serious suggestions on what not to do after caregiving. I feel like I'm having sort of like a caregiver midlife crisis. I did not picture my life post mom, which is kind of stupid. And I'm still trying to figure out like where I fit in the world. And it's been a lot more challenged than I expected. I did feel relief. My mom fell and broke her leg, so she bypassed a lot of the really ugly end stages of Alzheimer's. She'd had Alzheimer's for 20 years, so I really honestly felt that I was ready. I had stated very often that I was ready for her journey to be over. I kind of felt like she was probably ready, but she was still, still hanging on. And I was kind of surprised afterwards how how sad I was, how bad I felt. But then again, it was my mom, and I felt like I was kind of grieving the 20 years of losing the person that she was. So I'll have a little bit more to say when we get on the topic of what not to do after caregiving.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I think for you, I understand that, the almost lack of closure and such. My father, we live in Georgia, but my family is primarily in Philadelphia. And so I had to plan this funeral knowing that really no one was going to be here because I didn't know a lot of people. We moved right before COVID. And so I don't know a lot of people down here. And so I had to plan this funeral and spend thousands of dollars to know that really we had two family members that flew in and a close friend from high school and another friend who was a caregiver, really about 4 or 5 of us that were actually there. So even though I knew the reason why, and we were on Zoom as well, so there were about 40 people on Zoom, but it still stung just a little bit to walk into the church and know that this is my father and this is his celebration of life and we're saying goodbye and there are only 4 people here. So I absolutely understand that and understand not thinking about life after mom. What does that look like? Because we're so busy caregiving, right? So all of that is absolutely understanding. And the last thing that you said that really touched me before we hear from Christina is being ready for the journey to be over. And I think that's a nice segue. I'm not going to jump to the next question, but it's a nice segue into the next thing that we're going to talk about, because oftentimes some of us, me, at times, you are ready for the journey to be over, but then it's like, oh my gosh, how horrible do I sound? Because the journey ending means that my person is going to be gone. My father died. He was 76 years old. My mother has Alzheimer's and vascular dementia, but she's only 74. This could be another 20 years. So you feel guilty feeling that way. So I absolutely resonate with you. And I thank you so much for sharing that with us. And now we're going to kick it over to Christina and ask you to give us some more feedback or insight on this question of caregiving, life after caregiving, and how it matched up or did not match up with your expectations versus your reality.
All right. Thanks, Miss Felicia. Well, first of all, I want to talk about me and my mom. I had been taking care of her for 10 years. And when she had her stroke, they gave her 1% chance to live. So like the first 30 days, she wasn't supposed to make it, right? At any minute, they were like, she could die at any minute. So we didn't expect her to even make it out of the ICU. And we had 10 years, almost 10 years together. And there were many times in that 10 years that we thought she was going to pass. There was one time in 2017, the doctor said, yep, this is it. We had like all the family come in. The preacher came in, gave like the last rites. Mom said, hold my hand when I pass. She asked my best friend to take care of me after she passed. And we fell asleep holding hands. And doctor said, yep, this is it. And then she woke up and said, I'm not done, And so there were all of these times. And so me and my mom had a lot of end of life conversations. There was a lot of preparations. We knew like when the time came, what hospice was going to be like. But still like, it wasn't exactly like we thought, right? It was a little bit more scary. Like I thought, first of all, the process of my mom passing, I thought hospice was going to come in and, it was going to be all paid for. And I wouldn't, because I was spending like $3,000 a month on care. Little did I know, they just came in to check on stuff. And my caregiving expenses went up to $6,000 a month that last month. And I didn't know I'd have to be giving the comfort meds, And so, and I thought like we were going to have this moment where we were laying like side by side and she was just going to say, I love you. And I was going to say, I love you. And she was going to pass. And we were going to be holding hands. And, I thought I was prepared to find my mother passed. And that was the first thing that was a shocker to me. And I had gone upstairs for a minute, for like an hour to get some rest. And the caregiver that I had hired had come in and I said, well, let me check on my mom before you go in. And I went in and she had passed. And I remember telling the hospice people, I said, what happens when she passes? Like, what do you do? Who do you call? And they explained some people like, and this is going to be, kind of hard to hear, but this is what really happens. And it said some people, lay with the body, and I was like, oh, I would never do that. And but I found myself spending time with my mother, and saying that last goodbye, and I didn't expect to do that, and even when they took her out of the house, I didn't expect. I kept thinking, it's not real. This isn't real. There are so many times, and I think a lot of you probably had that moment after the person you cared for passed. Like, there are so many times they beat the odds. How did it really happen this time, right? And I knew that after she passed, I would be doing a lot of tasking to deal with the emotions. But I also thought, like, one of the things I said to myself, as soon as I get everything settled with her house, I'm going to get out a map and go like this and just close my eyes and pick a place to move. And I'm out of here, just running from my emotions. And I didn't do that, thank God. And I thought I'd feel all of this freedom because there was so much preparation and so many end of life talks and so many promises that my mom made me make to her that I was going to live my life, since my life had been put on hold for so long. And then I wasn't going to have to pay the $3,000 a month for care anymore. And little did I know, death can be more expensive sometimes than living. And my mother didn't have life insurance. And so, there was a lot of expectations that I had. And it was, no matter how much I prepared, and it's crazy because we hear about, I think sometimes when we're in the industry, we know about all of the logistics, right? And you can know all the information, you can know all the details and all the facts, and have, I had an end of life doula, I had a great hospice team, I had, professional caregivers, I had all of these things, but the emotions changes everything. And the reality of the person I love and the person who's beat the odds is gone. They're gone. Completely takes away from the expectations that you had. So it was very different. And so I had to do what I had to do in my everyday caregiver life, is pivot, just get it done, just show up. And I think in our caregiver life, we just have to show up and do what needs to be done without knowing what we're supposed to do, without any training. And even with all the preparation, all the conversations, I was back in that spot again. Just show up, regardless of the fear, the anxiety, the I don't know what to do. Just show up and do what needs to be done and be a caregiver. I had to do that afterwards as well.
Thank you so much, Christine. I think that we all have had a sense of that, right? Just showing up. I think you just really summarized it all. And it's so hard to share. But as we share our stories, I know that those that are listening, those that are watching, are really just being encouraged and at least feeling heard and feeling seen, because we all are facing this, have faced it, or if we're in the middle of our care journey, we are going to face it. And so thank you, ladies, again, for just being so open and being so vulnerable and sharing with us. So I said that I was sort of previewing another topic that we were going to talk about. And so I'm going to jump right into that now. And that is, how did each of you manage the mix of emotions that come with the care journey ending, especially the disbelief and the guilt? How did you manage the mix of emotions? And again, I'll kick it off, and then I'm going to bounce over to Jennifer so you can get prepared for that. But I'll say that I made a decision to try to take care of myself better than I had been taking care of myself. So there was a level of self-care. I have, at least for the past 4 years, since I've not been working outside of my home, when I was more of a full-time caregiver, I kind of look like whatever all the time. And so I've made a commitment to myself to try to look better. I have a skin routine. Hopefully my face is glowing. I have a skincare regimen and tried some new products and things like that. That may seem really silly on the surface, but it was really just important for me to begin to try to pull back some of my life and to take care of myself, to get back to the gym, to exercise, to eat good foods that were going to fuel my body and take care of me, hair, nails, all of those things. And then the last two things that I did to manage those emotions were grief recovery. So my church offered a no cost to me grief recovery program. And initially I was planning to do it for me and my mother, and found that because my mother has Alzheimer's and I have to do everything, that it was too stressful trying to have her participate and me at the same time, because I really wanted to have my own space. And so I decided to take care of the caregiver first, which oftentimes doesn't happen, right? We're always caring for everybody else and not caring for ourselves. And so I started an 8-week grief recovery program that has allowed me to be able to talk, to learn, to read. There's a book we're reading, I think it's called The Grief Handbook. And so we're going through that book together, one-on-one, with a grief recovery specialist. And that's allowed me to talk through, like, my father's birthday came up. What do I do for the birthday, and how do I feel? And, what do I focus on? Valentine's Day came up. What do I do for Valentine's Day? My parents spoiled me for Valentine's Day, and they spoiled each other, and things like that. And then the last thing that I've done, or that I will do, in fact, it's scheduled today, is I've gone back to therapy. So during my caregiving journey, I've been on and off of therapy, not because I didn't think that it was necessary, but because of the caregiving journey. Many of you may know, sometimes you're working, sometimes you're not. Sometimes you have insurance, sometimes you don't. And so I've had therapy off and on, and I'm actually going to be starting with a new therapist today. So that will give me the space to talk through the grief, to talk through how I'm feeling, to deal with just the whole mixed bag of emotions that come with the end of the caregiving journey. And then, of course, I think it's clear that I'm a person of faith. So I have just been steadfast in prayer, even during the last weeks of my father's life, when I wasn't really sure what was going on, and got to a point where, about 4 days before he passed away, for the first time ever, he was experiencing pain. We went to move him, and he said, ow, 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 ow. And it was at that moment that I told my husband, I love my father and I want my father here. And this wasn't, he's a handful and it's too much. This was more so him. I've never heard him express pain, and that hurt me to my core. And I said, I don't want him to have to be here if that's how he has to live. And so prayer also, and having a wonderful husband, have allowed me to walk through those different emotions. So, Jennifer, you are up next.
So my mom died right before, as I mentioned, right at the start of COVID. I did not get to see her the last 2 weeks of her life. Thankfully, the care home that she lived in did let me in about 36-ish hours before she passed. So I got to say all the things that I felt that I needed to say. Unfortunately, being the oldest of two and having always been kind of in charge of mom, I didn't say squashed, but I kind of held back how I felt, because I was trying to protect how other people felt, like my daughter, my niece, even to some respects, my sister. And I just kind of kept doing what I'd been doing all along. I had started my own podcast in 2018, and I didn't have anything else to do during COVID, so I kept doing that. I did pick up a new hobby that I continue and love to this day. When we downsized right before COVID, I got rid of all of the crafty supplies that I'd had, some of which I hadn't used in years and years, like 20. Some of them were newer, but not necessarily something I was going to continue to do. And I laugh now, because I had decided, when I figure out the hobby that I want to do, the crafty thing that I want to do, I will just go to the store and buy what I need. So much for those words. But I did pick up handmade greeting cards during COVID, and mostly because it does not have a steep learning curve to create something beautiful, and you can give the stuff away, and the neighbors aren't running away from you like, oh no, here comes Jennifer with another scarf or another Afghan, or, an armload of zucchinis. Like, we didn't want to alienate the neighbors. My neighbors love that they get a box of cards every Christmas, with cards to last them throughout the year. So that's a joy to make and a joy to share. So that's something that I continue to do. What is the rest of that question? The mix of emotions. Pardon me?
I was saying, any disbelief or guilt around the end of the journey?
Yeah, it was really lovely to hear my sister state that she didn't want to do a celebration of life for my mom because, quote, I'm not doing two things, I'm not paying for two things, as if she was going to pay 5 cents towards anything. So I did do my own things, but I still feel guilty that she is not interned with my dad, although I'm pretty sure that's being in a military cemetery is not her thing. And I know she wanted to be scattered, and I did have an opportunity to do that this past summer, and I left the cremains at home. So yeah, I kind of feel like she's on my mind, but she's not. It's like I love her and I miss her, but there's days when it feels like eh, whatever, which is not how I feel. So there are days it's really hard, and I don't think anybody really understands that because it's been almost 4 years. When she first died, I did I had a mix of, thank God we didn't have to deal with all the COVID stuff and mom, or, she had fallen and broken her leg. So she was now bed bound and wheelchair bound. And I was okay with the wheelchair, but I didn't think she would be. And so it was like, we got to miss a lot of that stuff. So there was literally like back and forth, relieved and sad, and relieved and feeling guilty for feeling relieved. And I still feel like that, excuse me, in a lot of respects. And again, I don't think anybody in my life understands that, believes it, cares. It's just my burden to bear because I didn't basically had one or 2 days to feel bad, and then everybody was like, moving on now. That may not be how they felt. That's how it was how I perceived it.
I understand. Thank you so much for sharing. I know that you've had some challenges, but it sounds like you've found some beautiful moments being able to scatter your mom's remains and, finding that hobby in the midst of everything else that you faced. And we're here. And we hear you and we see you and we do get it. That's one of the things I love about the Caregiver Champions is that I have found my tribe, right? When I can't talk to anybody else or other people don't understand, we have a really amazing group of Caregiver Champions all across the country who absolutely get it. And so that's really a wonderful thing. So thank you so much for sharing. We all have those mix of emotions, right? That's why we're talking about it. And it's so helpful to hear from other people and to realize I'm not crazy, right? This is normal, and to be able to embrace that and to be able to feel it and, to take the time that you need. It doesn't matter what I have been told, even before my father passed away, was that grief doesn't have a timetable. So whether it was 2 months like me or 4 years or even more, we all are going to experience this and deal with it in different ways, and it's going to come in waves. And we just have to embrace that. And like you said, just keep going. But we honor you. We honor your mother. We honor everything that you've done. So again, thank you so much for sharing with us. All right, Danielle, you are up next. And I'm going to kick it over to you. Do you need me to get you started with the question again?
So I was really lucky that I had a lot of closure when it came to my grandmother passing. Even though I really didn't like seeing her on life support, I really got we got our last I love yous, which most people don't get. We really had a lot of really good times and memories together that will never be replaced. But what I didn't realize is after caregiving, I had a lot of nightmares. So I was waking up a lot during the night, thinking that, my phone was going to ring because something urgent happened. I felt like I was still in caregiving mode. So even though I felt like I was getting into a new path, I felt like I was still in caregiving mode because my brain was already still processing being still a caregiver. So I wasn't sleeping really well. I was reaching out to people for help, and I felt like I was a burden to people because I was I'm grieving, I'm depressed. Who wants to call people up and ask for help when you don't want to be the Debbie Downer who just is just always complaining or always grieving. And so it was really hard for me to seek emotional help from friends and family. It was really of a time to really rely on support of a therapist for help, because it was that one place of comfort where I didn't feel like I was a burden to other people who didn't quite understand what I was going through. I'm grateful that Christina reached out to me and lended help, but that was probably the one real help that I received throughout, at least the first couple weeks after caregiving for emotional support besides my therapist. So I started journaling a lot is one thing that I really started to enjoy. For being a financial advisor, I thought that I wasn't going, I have a really tight rein on finances, and I feel like as a caregiver, we have really like a fine grained tooth when it comes to our budget. But that kind of like went out the window after caregiving. A lot of small things were just like adding up, like going to the funeral, like buying water because I forgot a water bottle at the house. Or like I wanted to buy like little silly things online because it made me feel better. And so it was just like, it felt like the bill was just like adding up really quickly. And then one day my daughter was just taking out her coloring book, and I was just sitting there like trying to process my grief. And I was like, I'm just going to color with her. Like, to me, like, it felt like going from like caregiving, which was like constantly like go, 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 to I'm just going to sit here and color, felt like kind of like a waste of time to me. But I was like, I'm going to just try this. Like, this maybe could be like our bonding time together. And it actually turned into a new self-care routine. So one of the things that I was really focusing on working with my therapist is how do I rebuild that self-care routine? And what does that look like now that I'm not a caregiver anymore, that I have more time to really focus on myself?
Thank you so much. I love it. So I haven't seen my therapist yet, but I feel like I'm ahead of the curve because I started with the self-care routine. So thank you. Maybe that's extra credit. Thank you so much for sharing. And last but not least, Christina, if you could just share with us how you've managed those mixed bag of emotions with everything that you've experienced as a two-time caregiver.
Yeah. Well, thanks all of your words of wisdom, you guys. Is interesting. Danielle, you brought up buying little things online, right? And it's funny. Retail therapy was definitely a part of my dealing with the mixed emotions that came with it. It's like, well, maybe if I get, this purse, or maybe if I get this, or if I get this. I mean, there was a drum that I bought that like almost made me feel okay for a minute. But other than that, like, nope, still felt sad. Nope, mom was still gone, like nothing fixed it. And I thought, something might take my mind off it, and it just didn't. And I went to a local hospice facility, and they had grief counseling there, and it was a lifesaver, right? So just FYI, any of you who are going through this journey, if you need grief counseling, a lot of the local hospice centers offer free grief counseling. And if they don't, they can tell you who in your city offers that. And so I was able to get with a grief counselor. The group sessions were really hard for me to hear all the other stories too. And so I was able to do some individual grief counseling. And then also they offered, I was willing to try anything. If somebody said there was, a special rock or a special candle or whatever, I was on it, because it hurts. It hurts. And the shock of it. And, like, again, how can my mother be gone? And, part of my story was too, that 6 months prior, my father, who I wasn't expecting to pass, had passed, and I hadn't been able to, process those emotions. But my dad would have been somebody who I would have gone to and said, hey, mom died. And, I didn't have that. And then, like many of us who have been caregivers, and many people who have had family that have passed, like, family separates. So I didn't have other family to talk to either. So it was kind of a lonely journey, and it is kind of a lonely journey, right? And so, the grief center offered things like sound baths were for people walking through grief, and they offered art therapy for people walking through grief. And actually, the art therapy was one of the things that really helped to process some of the emotions. And why it did is because for a minute, I wasn't having a million emotions going on in my body at once. For a minute, it's kind of like Danielle talked about, that coloring, just being able to like quiet the inside and not having, the disbelief, the grief, the anger, all of those emotions going on and running all at once, like everything gets quiet for a minute. So that really helped. And, you know, at first I didn't leave the house much because my emotions were all over the place. Like the worst thing that would happen would be like going to the grocery store and the checker would ask like, how are you today? And I don't know about you guys, but that question to me was like a total trigger, right? It's like, I'm miserable. My mother died, right? And then of course I can't say that, right? I got to be polite. And then inside I'm thinking like, why the heck do I have to lie about this, right? So I would just like give the person a blank stare for a minute and then like, okay, say, I'm fine. How are you? Right. But there's a million things going on in my head. And so it was just too exhausting to go to the grocery store. And so I just didn't leave the house because I was having a different emotion every 5 minutes. And I had to be okay with that being the process. Right. And, one of the things people talk about is there's like all these stages of grief, right? That there was this huge study. I'm going to tell you a little secret about that study, right? That study was done on people who were actually dying of cancer. That study was not done on the people who are living, that are staying alive afterwards, right? So for me, and for many people that I talk to who have gone through this journey, there's a different emotion every 5 minutes, and sometimes two or three, right? And one of the things that really, really helped me, and Danielle touched on this too, is, feeling like, people ask how you're doing. And it's like, if you really say it, you feel like a Debbie Downer and you don't want to be that. But then it's like, you just don't want to like, saying fine when you're really not is just not fun at all. And so I actually found a friend who, she had a loved one who passed around the same time as my mother. And so we've been able to journey together through that. And so, what's great about that is, we'll be out and about and one of us will start crying or one of us will start laughing for no apparent reason. And it's fine, right? We're able to deal with that because we understand that. And we can call each other and say, hey, I'm having all of these weird emotions today. And we don't have to worry about being that Debbie Downer. And I think, Felicia talked about the Grief Recovery book. That is a wonderful book. It's a purple book with gold and black writing on it, and it's called The Grief Recovery, and it's got very simple steps to follow because when you're walking through grief and disbelief, your mind sometimes isn't working correctly, right? And so I think for me, like all of those things, like, finding a friend, being proactive and getting, the grief counseling. Also, don't judge. Like, I tried not to judge what I was going through. Like, yes, I was going to be an emotional wreck. That's okay, right? That's I've never lost my mother before who I've taken care of. Like, this was a whole learning experience. I mean, if we're going through this, it'd kind of be like if we showed up at a new job and we're expecting to be the number one top employee who does everything right the first day, right? It's the same thing with grief. We've never lost our mom before, or our dad before, or our partner before who we took care of. So we have to give ourselves a little bit of grace. And so I managed to give myself a little bit of grace too. And I also didn't judge how I dealt with that. Like one of the things that I did, with my father is I started, pouring a cup of coffee for him in the morning and me in the morning. And, I would just have a moment with him, and yeah, it seemed crazy, but it made me feel better and it wasn't hurting anybody. With my mom, I would just have a conversation with her and talk to her, in her house, and that seems very crazy, but it made me feel better. And, that if we keep thinking, oh, we've got to act normal. Like, who decides what normal is for us, right? Who decides what normal is when we've lost somebody we love who has been a part of our life 24/7 and who has been the main focus of our life 24/7 for X amount of years, right? So just not judging and giving myself grace was one of the biggest things I did to manage some of those emotions. And, the disbelief, my mother died December 28th of 22. And I still sometimes think at any minute that front door is going to open and she's going to come rolling in her wheelchair. And when those thoughts come, I just have to be like, hey, thanks for sharing. I just have to like let it go and know that that is part of the grief process. So thanks for that question, Felicia.
Thank you so much. And again, ladies, thank you so much for sharing. I think we've shared some really good nuggets, and I hope that you've been able to pull some, as far as dealing with those emotions, from art therapy to a new hobby to journaling, coloring, grief recovery programs, right? I know Christina, like you, I did not want to sit in a group therapy session and hear everybody go through all sort of different than what we do here in the Caregiver Champions group, but I didn't want to do that. And so fortunately, my church was able to fund me having the one-on-one grief recovery. But, self-care, exercising, all of those things are really wonderful. And it really does hurt. It hurts. And while we're hurting, right, as Jennifer has said, it's like everybody else is just living their life. Everybody else is moving on. They're doing their thing. And part of you wants to be like, no, wait, look at me. I'm still hurting. I know it's been a year. I know it's been 2 years. I know it's been 3 years and I'm still hurting. Look at me. But then you think, like, Danielle, I don't want to be Debbie Downer. I don't want to be this person. It's a holiday and I feel horrible, but I don't want to call my friend and ruin her Christmas. I don't want to. So it's all of those things. And I think that Christina encapsulated it all by saying we have to give ourselves grace. I jokingly said, my father was the first father I ever lost. But it's true. It's exactly what Christina said, right? We've never lost these individuals before. And so we have to give ourselves grace and understand that we are taking these steps and doing the best that we can in dealing with something that we have little to no experience with. So thank you so much, ladies, for sharing. I'm going to kick it back to my lovely co-host, Christina, so that you can introduce our next topic.
All right. Thank you so much, Felicia. So I want to talk about caregiver recovery versus grief, right? So when my mother passed, there were a lot of things that were a little bit different than when my father passed. My father passed about 6 months before. I was not his caregiver. I loved him. I miss him dearly. There was grief. I started some grief counseling then, right? When my mother passed, there were some things that were different that didn't happen. And I remember posting, and I know a lot of folks in the industry, I know a lot of caregivers, and I asked the question on social media, like, how do you deal with the caregiver recovery? And a lot of the answers were grief related, right? And for me, there's a difference, right? The caregiver recovery, like, first of all, when you're a caregiver, like for me, for 10 years, I was in fight or flight mode, right? I was either going into an emergency, coming out of an emergency, preparing for an emergency, or in the middle of an emergency, right? At any moment, my mother could die. And that wasn't me being dramatic, but that was a fact, right? At any moment, she could choke. Any moment, she could have a seizure. Any moment, she could fall. Like there was, and her life really did. I know she had a God and it wasn't me, but her life really did depend on me to keep her alive the best I could, right? And that was my life. I was on call 24/7, right? And so my emotions were like this continually, like there was always being on call. I was always ready. I was always on call. There was constantly like almost like PTSD going on in my body. There was like depression, there was anxiety, there was anticipatory grief. There was this, I love my mom so much. And I'm so grateful I'm her caregiver, along with, oh my God, I want to quit my job as a caregiver. There was so much going on inside of me, right? And then, constantly, like there were times of the day that I knew like at 10 o'clock in the morning, like this is when, she starts to toss and turn. 12 o'clock in the morning is when the caregivers come in. 3 o'clock in the morning is when I check the cameras again. And 5 o'clock in the morning is when I check the cameras. So when she passed, I knew about processing grief because I had 6 months of working with a grief counselor on how to process grief. I didn't know how to deal with the caregiver recovery. And the caregiver recovery part of it is, how do I get out of fight or flight mode? Because when you're dealing with grief, when it's not a caregiving situation, a lot of times from what I hear, if it's just grief, a lot of people like sleep. They don't like go out of the house for days. They don't like, I don't know. But I wasn't able to sleep right away, because I haven't slept in 10 years, right? I mean, I'm getting 5 to 10 hours of sleep a week in the past 10 years, right? And so the fight or flight mode, like, how do I come down from that? I had to literally like work on, okay, I'm going to try to sit down. I'm going to try to sit down. I'm going to try to not get up, right? I had to work on like setting down my phone. I had to sometimes set my phone in another room for like 10 minutes and just leave it there and be okay. And the anxiety I felt by not being near my phone, because for 10 years, that phone was like attached to my hip because it was the mom hotline, right? Just even learning how to do that. And then when, it was always them first, it was always them first. And now there's me, like, okay, how do I put me first now? Like the other day, I treated myself to something that was really nice, and what happened was I thought to myself, I felt so guilty, right? I would have done that for my mom a million times, but not for me, right? And so the caregiver recovery part of it is, how do I stop thinking I need to wake up and check the cameras at 3 a.m.? How do I stop thinking I need to, like, on the 15th of the month, like, separate and sort my mom's pills? Like, how do I stop and not be anxious? And here's what I'm going to tell you. So I've worked for a year, right? Really, really hard to like calm down my cortisone levels. I did all kinds of research on bringing down my cortisone levels to get out of fight or flight mode. I have worked diligently. It is like a full-time job trying to get out of fight or flight mode when you've been in fight or flight mode because you've been a caregiver for that many years. So I've worked really hard on doing that. Now, I am still a caregiver for my ex-boyfriend since 2019, but my caregiver responsibilities are very minimal with him right now, because at the same time my mother was going on hospice, he had had his last stroke, and I had to put him into adult family home where he gets 24-hour care. And because it was Medicaid spin down, I had to make sure he had a state guardian, because I didn't want to mess that up. And it was in his best interest for somebody else to manage that. So my caregiving responsibilities are very minimal with him. And so I don't have a lot of those, like, constantly having to be prepared for an emergency, right? And it'd been a long time because things are going very smoothly for him. The other day I got a call, and there was a sort of what I thought was an emergency. And my body immediately remembered what it was like to be in that, like, somebody's going to die or something horrible is going to happen. And I went into caregiver mode, and, the problem was fixed within, 15, 20 minutes. But it took my body 5 hours to calm down. And when I hadn't felt that in my body in so long, it was amazing to me what I thought. My blood pressure went up. I got a stress headache, like all of these things. All I could think, I don't think we understand as caregivers what we're putting our body through. And this is why those statistics of, 30% of caregivers pass before the people they love. And 35% of them pass within 5 years of the person they love. And 65% of caregivers that are over the age of 70 pass before the person they love that they're caring for. This is why the statistics are so real, because we're putting our body through, right? And so, it took me 5 hours to bring that down. And I didn't even have to. Before, I had to, I didn't have 5 hours to calm down. I still had to take care of mom. I still had to be there at night. I still had to do all of these things. So yeah, caregiver recovery is very different. And it takes a lot to bring those cortisone levels down, get out of fight or flight mode, get out of that thinking that everything is, gonna be in emergency mode, and really to learn how to sit down and color, sit down and relax, right? It's very different. So I want to hear about, like, how you guys have really seen, what are some of the differences you've seen between caregiver recovery and grief, and maybe how have you guys worked on some of that? And we'll go to Danielle and then Jennifer.
Yeah, especially the early days of after caregiving was really rough. I didn't really want anything to do with caregiving, even though it's something that I was so passionate about and advocating for. Obviously, I'm here. So It's something that, I still live day in and day out, even though I'm not necessarily a caregiver anymore. But I really tried to do everything I could to not associate with caregiving. I got rid of all her care supplies first. I threw it all in the garage and donated it all as quickly as possible. I was just I didn't want to see it anymore because most of that stuff I'd bought for her or got donated from somebody else. It just felt like it was something that reminded me of what caregiving was like. I was ready to just sit on a couch and eat potato chips every day because that's what seemed normal. And then I was also thinking to myself, how can I be an advocate for others when I'm no longer caregiving anymore? Do I still fit in that community of being a family caregiver if I'm not actively being one anymore? And that's what really hit home to me. And I relate to a lot of things that Christina said because especially those early days of, really trying to think about, shifting what your life would look like. And when you've been so immersed into caregiving, it's very hard to transition out of that or transition to a less form of caregiving.
All right, Jennifer. Thank you, Danielle.
I'm not sure I've done the caregiver recovery very well. There was a lot of options during COVID. I mean, my mom died 10 days after the lockdowns, if I can do math this early in the morning, which is not probably accurate. I do know that I'm not good with other people having medical emergencies. I deal with it, but probably not as lovingly as they would like. And a lot of it is just between my mom and my dad and feeling like I had to be there for everybody else. I just don't have it in me at this point. I probably would have been better off if I had changed careers entirely. So during the pandemic, and because we had downsized from the house that I had a built-in photography studio with, I gave up the portrait photography as a career. And sometimes I look back on that and I think that's a mistake. So there was a lot of choices and decisions made during that time that I not so certainly they were the right choices. So again, I'm not really sure I'm doing the recovery right, which I guess is part of the recovery process.
I don't think there's any right or wrong, right? So, and then Miss Felicia.
So I think I'm going to be short and sweet here. I am so fresh in this thing that I don't know what part is grief and what part is caregiver recovery, and then I'm still a caregiver, so I really don't know. I do know that during my last grief recovery session, so much of what we were talking about was so closely connected to me grieving as a caregiver that it became very apparent to me that I needed a therapist. In fact, that's actually what made me go and schedule the therapist that I'm going to be seeing today, because so much of what we talked about in that last session, and I don't even know if, to be very honest, and he's really great on the grief recovery side of things, but I don't know if the person that I'm working with was prepared for the answers and the responses that I was giving, because everything was so, you could not separate caregiving from it. And so it made me realize that I had some really deep seated issues around caregiving that are complicating or making the grief recovery just really, really challenging. So I am still in process. I'm listening to find out from you guys, because I don't know what is caregiving, what's grief, what's stress, I'm 47. I don't know at this point. I don't know what it is, but I just have hope that I will be able to get through it all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, you guys. We're coming up to the end of our show here, but before we close out, I'd love to hear from you guys a 1 or 2 sentence piece of advice that you'd like to share with anybody who's walking through that journey of life after caregiving. How about Miss Danielle? We'll start with you.
Yeah, I think that I was just so go after caregiving that I forgot to process my own emotions and my own grief. So don't forget about yourself and take time to process the grief.
Thank you. And Jennifer, 1 or 2 sentences.
Well, I second what Danielle said, but I'm going to highly stress not to make big choices afterwards. Even if it's a parent, like it sounds like all of us have experienced. Sometimes those choices aren't necessarily what you might make a year or 2 later. And please don't jump into caregiving for somebody else. You really need to take time for yourself.
Great. And Miss Felicia.
I would say find that 1 or 2 possibly people that you can just absolutely talk to and be transparent. And then give yourself grace. We've said it before, but give yourself grace. None of us have experienced what we are experiencing before. Even if you've been a caregiver already, losing your mother is different from losing your father, is different from losing your grandmother, is different from losing a child. So give yourself grace and know that you will get through it. Give yourself grace.
Absolutely. And my advice would be there is no normal, right? And your relationship with the person you lost can be very different than, the relationship they had with somebody else. It's a very personal journey. Not only the grief, but your caregiver recovery journey is a very personal journey as well. So be kind to yourself, right? So thank you guys for joining us today on this episode of Champions Corner Real Talk with Real Caregivers. Make sure to subscribe to the channel on YouTube, so you don't miss any of our episodes, and especially our next episode where we'll be talking about having to leave your career to care for a loved one. How many of us have had to do that before? Yep, many of us have had to do that, right? So, and make sure that you follow caregiving.com on all of our social media channels. And if you'd like to apply to be a caregiving.com champions, you can go to caregiving.com/champions to apply, or simply text champions to 360-230-7736. Thanks for joining us today. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye. Thank you.